Several years ago, when I was pastoring in Kearney, Nebraska, I met a friend that some of you may know because he was your interim here for a period of time, and that was Pastor Rick Jensen. Rick was a brilliant scholar in many ways, loved to read, and he introduced me to a book called The Fourth Turning. And this book, what it explained was that how history goes in cycles. And it talked about how for each generation, which they say is about 22 to 25 years, it's not an exact cutoff date, but that people go through experiences. There's normally some tragic event that shapes the life of people. And of course, they talked about for my parents' generations, it was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and how that everyone remembered that and exactly where they were when they heard. That was brought home to me when we celebrated my mother's 80th birthday, and her good friend growing up was not able to come and celebrate because she was facing cancer at that time. But she had written my mom a long letter with many memories in it. But the one memory that really stood out, as my mother showed us, was where they were and what they did when they heard about Pearl Harbor being bombed. Then, of course, for my generation, it was the shooting of President Kennedy, and many of us remember where we were then. But then it seems to go from that, I begin to look back and say, what are the generations that follow me? What are those events that seem to strike them, because it seems as though there's been so many that occur. We can think back to the Challenger blowing up, to the bombing of the Oklahoma City federal building, to the shootings at Columbine, of course to 9/11, and yet we seem almost every few weeks in our news of some other major event that occurs. And what do those go back and have for us to remember? Here, Isaiah, in our passage of Scripture, he goes to an event that stands out in his life. As they began the reading, and this was the early part of his ministry, he talks and he says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord." Uzziah had been king of Israel for 52 years. It was a time of great prosperity and great security, but at the end of his reign, things had begun to turn. His pride had led to his downfall. He had kind of begun to think that he was invincible and take over everything, including the role of the priest. And he went in and did things in the temple that were only allowed for the priest, and he thought he could order them around. But yet it still struck the community. And there we hear Isaiah saying, when he died, I saw the Lord. He had a vision of what was happening. And this was the vision that, as we hear at the end of this, when it is said, whom shall I send to my people? Whom shall I send as a prophet to get them back into the way of the straight? And Isaiah responds, here I am, send me. Isaiah's vision of God was of a majestic God who filled the whole temple with his clothing. It was in that sense of a vision that he heard God calling out to him. And there he listened and he went. And maybe a question is to us, where is God still speaking to us? Our other story from Luke's gospel is the story of Jesus visiting with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. This is recorded both in Luke's gospel and in John's gospel. In the gospel of John, it's a much longer story. And not only does Mary sit there at the feet of Jesus and listen to his teachings, but she also breaks a jar of expensive perfume and pours on his feet. She washes his feet and dries them with her hair. But there it is that when Mary and Martha are there, and Martha is so busy doing the things that she thinks she could, that she comes and asks Jesus, "Why will you not have my sister help me?" And Jesus says to her, she is doing what is most important. She is listening to my voice. She is learning from my teaching. She is growing in her sense of faith. And yet I think for us that is a good pointing out to us, where are we today? How many times we become so busy doing things that we fail to stop and listen? Or what we do stop and listen to is the endless news, the endless deals that drag us down. And yet when we need to stop and listen for the voice of God to speak to us, the voice of God to come to us. T.S. Eliot wrote in his poem, Courses in the Rock, endless inventions and endless experiments brings knowledge of motion but not of stillness, knowledge of speech but not of silence, knowledge of words but an ignorance of the word, knowledge that brings us near to our ignorance, and all of our ignorance brings us nearer to death. But nearness to death, but no nearer to God. And I think a question we must ask ourselves is, where do we listen to God today? Where do we go to listen to the voice of God, or how do we form that? And I will admit, it is very difficult for us. When I served, as I said, in Kearney, Nebraska, for which I served for 12 years, Kearney was a growing town, and one of the things that was amazing for this town when we went with a little over 20,000 was it had developed a very major hospital there. It was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Kearney was 130 miles from Lincoln, and it became a major hospital center because of some of the aggressiveness of the hospital administrators and all of the people there. And so when we were there, even though we were in a town of 20,000, which normally you think of as maybe having a small hospital with a few doctors and a few specialists, this was one that had over 120 doctors present. Heart surgeons, neurosurgeons, all of the specialists you expected to find in big cities. And yet it drew people from well over 100 miles, because you either had to go to Lincoln if you went east, which was the easier way. But if you lived west or north or south, there were no major hospitals for hundreds of miles, because that was a lot of desolate country out there, a lot of big farms, a lot of ranches, but not much people. As I remember telling one of our exchange daughters that we had when we were taking a trip up north into South Dakota, and she said, "I don't have cell service." And we said, "Well, there's probably not service out here." And she said, asked the question, "Do any people live out here?" And my wife turned to her and said, "Well, have you seen any houses recently?" And her response was no. And she said, "Well, that's your answer." They love to say about the sandhills of Nebraska, a lot more cows than people. But it was in that sense a place that people would be flown in by helicopter or come in for major hospitalizations. And so a lot of the ministers and people would call and say, "Could you make a visit on someone? I can't afford to drive 100 and something miles just to make visits." And so I did. So I spent a lot of time at the hospital there of Good Samaritan with not only my parishioners, but also others from other places. But one of the things that I found that there was that they had 10 what we would call kind of motel rooms as a part of the hospital. And that was because, as I said, so many people had to come in for major hospitalization issues. But if you walked around, which these were kind of on a back hallway, hid back in the way, but if you walked past them, there was a small chapel. A chapel that had been built early on in that hospital when it was a small hospital started by Catholic nuns. And there it stood. And I would find myself quite often walking back there, especially after trying times, either from visiting people in the hospital or just the trying times of work. But it was a quiet place in this busy hospital. It was small, but it had beautiful stained glass. And yet it also had, of course, in the back right-hand corner, the candle set up where people would come and light candles, and a booklet there for people to write their prayer request. And the nuns who were the chaplains there would come each morning and pray over those that had been left there, to lift them up in prayer. But what was a place I could go and quiet myself and listen for God. And I know many other ministers, as I got to know them, talked about that they would go and spend time there too. Sometimes when you would walk in, maybe there would be a person or a family there praying for their loved one that was sick. But quite often it was a place of loneliness, just you by yourself. And the hospital, as it was growing, and it had already expanded greatly while I was there, decided that what it needed to do was to tear down the chapel and build some other part of the hospital that was needed. Fortunately, many of the people in Kearney, especially some of the Catholics that had much money, said, "No, you will not destroy that chapel. That is too important." And I thought that was a great statement that the people would make, would say, we need that place. The people who are there need that place. And of course, I was delighted when they said that they would not do it. But maybe that begs a question. Where do we go and listen to the voice of God? I know for many it's a sense of when you can get out in nature and allow God to speak. Others, maybe it is just a place around your house where you can go and find. But sometimes it's hard for us to set aside not only the place, but also the time when we can say we need to hear God speaking to us. And I think that is something we need to hear more and more today. We need to stop and listen for God to speak to us. We hear so much chatter, so much anger, so much bitterness, so much bad news that we need to listen for God to call us, for God to speak, for God to be one that hears us and allow us to hear Him. Yes, I know I've worked with many people and they always talk about, well, this is what you need to do. This is what you need to have this place or this, or you need to set aside this time. But one of the things I have found that what people really need to do is find what works for them. For Isaiah, it was a vision in the temple. For Mary, it was the sense of not worrying so much about what society had expected of her, but rather to listen to Christ and to find the courage there to follow. For we need to listen. Listen deeply. Listen intently. And simply say as we hear that voice, "Here I am, Lord. I am your servant." Reverend Mary Alice Birch serves as the pastor of Highlands Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. She wrote a couple of years ago a story about her own sense of calling to ministry and what it meant. And she wrote this to a person who disagreed with her and said he did not think women should have a place in ministry. And yet she says, as she wrote this, "I recognize that you and I do not see eye to eye on women in ministry. And I have no intention of trying to change your mind. I tend to agree with Madeline Robinson, who wrote in Gilead, 'Nothing true can be said about God from a posture of defense.' I feel no need to try to defend myself to you or the calling God has placed on my life. Instead, I want to say to you today that I am sorry your God is so small. I am sorry your God is so small that God can only speak through less than half of the human voice. She talked about a child growing up, and she said, I used to learn in Sunday school and church to sing the song that said, my God is so big, so strong, and so mighty, there's nothing that God cannot do. And I guess I took the words a bit too seriously. Obviously, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. And over the time, she said, I began to realize that the picture I had needed to be colored outside of the line, and that I discovered what God's calling was for me. No, we are not all called into ministry, as we like to describe it, as the one who stands and proclaims the word and does the sacraments. But we're all called to be ministers of God, to serve our fellow human beings, to find out what God is calling us to do. And then we do that by discovering how big and how mighty our God is, and how truly we can reach out and teach each other and love one another. After all, as she says, there is nothing that love cannot do. As I said, Isaiah responded, here I am, Lord, send me. In the midst of his grief, in the midst of his confusion, in the midst of the confusion of his nation, he began to say, I can be a voice for God, a voice that we still read and hear today. We still need to hear that voice of God. Yes, we are Easter people who believe in the resurrection, but we are also a Pentecost people. Those who believe that the Spirit will still move and give us the courage to witness to the word and deeds of God among us. For the Spirit still speaks to us and calls us to be a people of wholeness in a broken and fragmented world. Are you listening for God to speak to you today? And how will you respond? The voice of the God is not silent. Let us listen for his voice, not just above the noise of the crowd, but sometimes in that stillness. For God is still speaking. God is calling us to be his people in a broken and fragmented world. Thanks be to God for his grace that makes us sufficient and welcomes us to be his people, doing his work and his will. Amen.